Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Adam Smith Institute, the home of sound economics, and welcome to our Enlightenment Evening. And I'm delighted to welcome Tejvan Pettinger, who is the author of this excellent book, Cracking Economics, available from all reputable bookstores. And he also runs a really fantastic online resource called Economics Help, which got me through my A-levels and got me through my undergrad, and now I'm here. So well done. Thank you very much. Tejvan is an economics teacher by trade, and he read PPE at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, taking the E at the end to the full extent. He's also a championship cyclist, winning the British National Hill Climber Award in 2013, I think it was. Yeah. There you go, pretty good stuff. So just a little bit about the Adam Smith Institute. If you're new to us, we are a free market think tank based here in London. We champion some of the educational work that economics can do, really trying to educate the public, policymakers, that's a very important part, and anyone who's willing to listen to us about good economics and an open society. Some of our work in economics includes we campaigned for full expensing, which has now been made permanent and recommitted to by both of the main parties in their manifestos. We also campaigned previously for a flat tax, which we can come on to later, and our famous Tax Freedom Day, which unfortunately this year is at a record late date of June 6th. How very sad. Anyway, so I'd like to crack on. Tejvan, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you decided to write about economics away from your day-to-day job?
Well, thank you. Yes. I enjoyed economics at university and teaching it, and in the early 2000s, I had a few students who didn't turn up, so I had a bit of spare time. So I created a website, just used my notes, and that kind of grew. And what I really enjoyed about economics is trying to explain it in simple terms, so even non-economists can get an understanding of what's going on, to try to demystify it, try to avoid ideological extremes, and just present, facts and understanding so people can get a better idea of the world that's going on. And I remember a few years after I started the website, of course, I had a great credit crunch. Mm-hmm. And suddenly everyone's interested in economics. What's gone wrong? How could this happen? So it was really interesting being able to talk about some of the things which were going on. And of course, with something like the credit crunch, we were all learning ourselves, because we didn't really know how bad the banking sector had got and things like that. So that's kind of my take on economics. So I enjoy it, and I enjoy explaining the fundamentals.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Cracking economics goes through 3,000 years of economical and financial theories. So to you, after researching and writing this book, which ancient theories have rung true and which have been consigned to the dustbin of history?
Well, to be honest, the early history of economics is pretty thin. And economics doesn't really exist so much as a subject until really Adam Smith.
Hoping you can say that.
And, whenever you're researching a book on Adam Smith, when you're researching a book on economics, Adam Smith is really a pillar of economics. And for one of the most interesting chapters, and writing the book kind of brought this home more. But before Adam Smith and the new kind of free market economists, the dominant economic theory was something called mercantilism. And basically, it's this idea that we have limited resources. Life is a zero-sum game. And if you want your country to be richer, what do? You get silver from another country, because resources are limited. And this is kind of quite a powerful idea, because if you think the world is like this, then it kind of encourages colonialism. Go off to the Americas or India to get gold. But then, one of the really important insights of Adam Smith and other economists later was that actually it's not a zero-sum game. And we can all become better off. If we trade and we specialize what we're good in, we can become richer. But also, we're not becoming richer at the expense of somebody else. And if our neighbour becomes better off, that's good.
Mhm.
So this was a really, important development in the not just economics, but also the political thing, because then, trade and sharing resources, specializing what you're good at, is an alternative economic system that hopefully also pushes a more peaceful world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to that development of economics, can you recall any really great jumps, apart from Adam Smith, of course? And why do you think those big jumps in economic thought occurred? Keynesianism, monetarism, etc., etc.
Yes, I mean, often they're, a response to certain issues. I mean, certainly the 1930s was a very unique decade in that the economy got tremendously depressed. And this had never really happened on that scale before. And the insight of Keynes was that it didn't have to be like that, because there's a wonderful concept called the paradox of thrift. And it's good to save. But what happens if everybody starts saving all at once? And this happened in the Great Depression because people panicked, they lost money on the stock market. And so people were saving more on a personal level. And so Keynes said, well, in this situation, we should make use of these unused savings, get the unemployed back to work. And so it was very specific to the time. I mean, sometimes I was talking to someone earlier about popular Keynesianism, people thinking it always means spending more, always having a deficit. It doesn't. It's only in a very specific situation where you have mass unemployment. So Keynes is a very interesting, for me, development.
Absolutely. We often say, economics is a dismal science. And I'm going to rehash one of your excellent chapters in here. Do you think economics is actually an art, a humanity?
Yes, it's a good question. And I'll give you a typical economist answer, which is a bit of a fudge. I mean, I think there's an element of both, because there is definitely a scientific basis. We need data. You can have mathematical models, but there is an element of it being an art as well. Like, how do you make use of that data? Because, one of the fun things I sometimes do on my blog is present the same data in different light. And you realize how much kind of influence you can have by the way that you present things. If you want to portray a certain view, then you can, use it in a certain way. So it's both a science and an art.
I mean, what's your take on Austrian economics in that case? They usually say Austrian economics doesn't like numbers, whereas the mathematical empiricists are very, very much in favour of using numbers. Do you think that's a superior system?
It'd be hard to give a definitive answer. I mean, to be honest, I sometimes feel that especially modern economics gets too caught up in very complex mathematical models. And I think it is good to take a step back and think, well, what's happening in the real world? And I mean, maybe that's also my bias in that I was never an advanced mathematician. Maybe I had done a lot of mathematics, then I would be more sympathetic to that mathematical model. But I do feel that it is important to, even if you've got good models, take a step back and think, how is it actually affecting the world?
Well, you speak of mathematics. Famously, Rishi Sunak has suggested that math should be made compulsory for everyone until the age of 18. Do you think that economics should be made compulsory for everyone up to the age of 18 instead?
Well, I think it'd be very good if we made economics compulsory for all MPs. I mean, I think that a bit of economic education would definitely not go amiss. And also, I think that, I think it's a really good idea because, as an economist, you're always explaining something very basic which you take for granted, like what does a fall in inflation mean? Mm-hmm. And this has caused a great confusion. Very interesting thing, in America, the inflation rate came down to like 3%. But all my American friends are complaining about how bad inflation is. What they mean is that to go to a diner is 25% more expensive. And so there's this kind of disconnect that economists keep saying, oh, economics numbers are looking pretty good. We've got inflation down and people are seeing the price level. So even things like the effect of interest rates that it's so important to more ordinary life, and you've got a mortgage and things like that. So somehow to get these real world ideas taught to children would be a very useful life skill. And I mean, I am biased, but I do actually think that economics A level is a really good subject. The reason I say that is that it really teaches you to always evaluate. You have this idea, higher interest rates will lead to lower demand. But the skill, as I'm sure you learned, is that it depends. Sometimes higher interest rates may have a different effect. What's the effect of putting up higher tax rates? If you put up income tax, will people stop working? And if you look at, say, an extreme example, like a few years ago, France had a super tax of, I think it was 80-85%. And a lot of French just went to Belgium because it was like so high tax. But if you try to make the same argument to, say, America, where taxes were income tax, I don't actually know the tax rate, but it's certainly a lot lower than France's 80%, then the effect may be different. So I can't remember how I got onto that, but it's called economic education. Yes, good idea.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of the educational side and understanding economics, and of course the publication of economics help, do you think economic misinformation remains a challenge? And obviously you're, as an educator, trying to combat that a lot. Do you think there's a lot of this sort of misunderstanding of economics? Do you think it remains a really big challenge in everyday life? There's this thing called girl maths, if you've heard of this before. Have you not heard of girl maths? It's the idea, I'll explain it. It's the idea that essentially you can use little financial tricks that make no economic sense, but somehow save money. For example, you can spend, if it's a 2-piece onesie, for example, you can spend twice as much because you're covering 2 pieces of clothing, and therefore you save money, etc., etc. Do you think that sort of misinformation could remain a challenge, even for policymakers?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at the, not necessarily, but you can't help but notice the election, and it's a very often superficial debate that you have, and it's easier just to say we're not going to change any taxes because it might cause political problems. But ideally, you want a situation where you can approach these issues in a more nuanced way to think, let's strip out ideology, what would actually make things better. And so, of course, it is easy to use data, as I was saying, to present a certain point of view, and it's very easy for it to be misleading.
Yeah. Speaking of, the election, I mean, Britain's facing a lot of challenges at the moment. So housing, the overprinting of money, high taxes, and as we would argue, over-regulation. As an economics teacher, how would you essentially, ask policymakers to kind of think differently about these policies?
Well, I think the perhaps biggest challenge the UK faces at the moment is, say, the housing market, for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's really affecting people's standard of living. Especially young people renting in London, it's a huge chunk of their disposable income. But also there's an economic cost because, I know London firms struggling to employ workers. Workers are finding it hard to live here. So therefore it's holding back economic activity. So I think if there's one policy that could, improve both living standards and economic activity, it would be to improve the housing market, changing planning regulations so it's easier to build where they're needed, to, if necessary, use public money to help build social housing. But it's a real crisis, and I was actually speaking to someone earlier about this, and we have the paradox that all the political parties will say, we want to build 300,000, 380,000, 400,000 homes. And it's very easy to come up with a national figure. But on a local level, there is a big kind of NIMBY block for whatever reason. So finding a way to, build the houses that the UK needs. And unfortunately, if you compare it to other countries, like in Europe, the UK is really lagging behind. Got very low vacancy rates, about 1%, whereas in other European countries much higher. So I think this is one aspect of policy that the government could make a difference. And in a way, I've given you two different approaches. There's a more free market approach, which is to think, let's change the quite restrictive planning laws, which came in 1947, which really give a very strong veto to people who own a house in certain areas. But also that I think that housing can be a public good, and that increasing the stock of social housing can help to deal with some social problems like the rising homelessness, which is a big problem. I think, again, UK, one of the highest rates of homelessness in the world, in the developed world. And of course, this then costs society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you make YouTube videos, you write a blog, I'd call it an encyclopedia even, multiple books you've published. How do you think young people best absorb education on economics?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started, I always wanted to write articles because that's what I enjoyed reading. Mm-hmm. I didn't actually like watching YouTube videos because they always seemed to not be very good and take a long time to get to the point. But actually, I found that young people do like the videos. But I think the real secret of education is to kind of get a young person to thinking and say, look, this is a problem, let's say the UK economy. How would you go about answering it? These are different possibilities. These are different schools of thought. These are different approaches. And in a way, economics A-level is quite good in that, you've got some basic problems and you teach different solutions, and it has to be a degree of interactivity.
Absolutely. Finally, can you make a pitch as to why everyone who's watching in the future or in the room should buy your excellent book?
Well, my mother said it was very good. This is the first reason. Second reason is that, well, I think that it's just quite easily accessible. It is trying to explain economics to someone who hasn't done economics A-level or any economics at all. And it's fairly neutral. It's just trying to explain different ideas. It's not pushing any agenda or any particular ideology. It's just presenting, the different thoughts, different schools of thought. But what you'll hopefully get is an understanding of some of the really quite interesting concepts. So you ever wanted to know what a zero-sum game is or moral hazard? If you've been too shy to ask, then this is a book